One of the properties that you'll have access to in the lettering properties windows is the connection type. And what that deals with is where one letter ends and the next one begins, and if you don't trim, where that thread will be. So let's take a look at the connection types and how to change that. If I select a lettering segment and I have my object properties open, or I could right-click on it and go to properties to open that box, just below line type you will see connection type. The default setting is as digitized. Now what that means is the letters will sew out as the digitizer had intended. So where the letters meet and join at certain areas and overlap is exactly how the digitizer had planned. If we change those connection types, we're going to be changing how those letters sew out and the layers in which they sew. So the first one is as digitized. Usually I'm going to be using this whenever my letters are large enough that I'm going to notice that my letters are layering differently. So I would use that for larger letters, letters that I know that I'm going to be trimming in between. If I'm using smaller lettering, let's say something like about 1/3 of an inch, whenever you're dealing with lettering this small, you may want to leave those connections and not trim between your letters. That will help prevent extra tie stitches so that you don't have little dimples and little bumps on the ends of your stitches or on the ends of your letters where those tie stitches are. The smaller your letters are, the harder it becomes to hide those tie stitches. So instead of hiding them, if you just leave your connectors, you don't have to worry about it as much. Now if you're going to trim those later by hand, you do need to worry about it and you do need to have those tie stitches in there. But if you're going to leave those connectors, your sew out will be smoother and the overall look of your design will actually be smoother. And I know that sounds a little bit weird with those extra stitches being in there, but it can actually work and be smoother. If I'm dealing with smaller lettering, instead of choosing a connection type of as digitized, if I'm going to be leaving those tie stitches in, or pardon me, those connectors in there, what I may choose to do is have them connect wherever my letters are the closest. So if I change my connection type to closest point, it will move those connectors wherever the letters are actually closest. So now if I go to actual size, you can see that those connectors are wherever they're the closest, and they're a little bit harder to see. Now, when I'm dealing with smaller lettering, there's some other properties that I would be changing. I might add a couple points of pull offset to make those letters a little bit bolder. The other thing that I may do is I may choose to kern them a little bit more tightly so that it helps hide those connectors. And at this point, that might have been just a little too tight. Let's bring this back out just a touch. There we go. And at this point, I have small lettering where my connectors are wherever the letters are the closest, and yet they're still nice and difficult to see, and it looks like normal lettering. So I've got as digitized for when my letters are larger and they're going to be trimming in between. I've got closest point for when my letters are smaller and I'm not going to trim. And then the other option I have is bottom connect. What that does is it connects wherever, pardon me, not wherever they're the closest, but instead where they're along the bottom. Now this works fairly well for some letters, but for some words like toy, wherever the space is widest along the bottom, that perhaps would not be your best option. In fact, for something like this, I might choose closest point. And now they're connecting where they're closer, and that's going to work out fairly well for me for small lettering. So if closest point is working so well for me for small lettering, why wouldn't I leave it on all the time? It seems very convenient. And the reason that I would do that is because, again, it's going to resequence those letters and it's going to change the look of the letter. Now, when you're dealing with small lettering, you're not going to notice that as much. But if you're dealing with larger lettering, you are going to notice that difference. So let's take a look at when that difference would take effect. Let's change this back to something that we would notice and change this to as digitized. And let's make this bigger. So let's make it 1 inch tall. And if we look on the corner of these E's where it's mitering, you can see you have this nice diagonal and it kind of creates that picture frame look where that cuts right across there. If I change where these connectors are and go to closest point, it's going to resequence this letter so that this top part sews after this middle part. and that's going to change how this top corner is being sewn. The top edge will sew over the vertical piece, and it will overlap in a way that doesn't look quite as clean as if I were to leave it as digitized. So again, for larger letters, I tend to leave my connection point or my connection type to as digitized. For smaller letters that I'm not going to trim between, I tend to leave my connections as closest point, and that will keep all of my connectors wherever they are the closest and keep me sewing a lot cleaner. So you've got options for the size of lettering and how to keep those connections either hidden or keep your connections so that they're easier to trim out and keep your letters layered nicely. So as digitized for your larger letters, bottom connect for your tiny letters, and you should be good to go with any of your lettering sizes and those connection types.